It sat in the corner of the room, ancient and mysterious, its brass frame tarnished with the weight of years. A large, ornate clock with intricate carvings spiraling up its sides, its wooden frame darkened from the passage of time. But what made it truly unique, what made it impossible to ignore, was its hands. They never moved forward, only backward, ticking against the normal flow of time. The first time Clara noticed the clock, she thought it was simply a curious design flaw, a relic from another time. But the more she observed, the more uneasy she became. It wasn't just a broken timepiece. There was something unnerving about it, something that made her wonder if the clock wasn't just a part of the house, but perhaps a living, breathing entity in its own right. It was a gift from her grandmother, passed down through generations. It has a way of keeping time, her grandmother had told her with a knowing smile. But Clara never thought much of it until she began living in her late grandmother's house. The clock had been placed in the living room, but as Clara soon realized, the time it kept wasn't like any other. At midnight, its hands spun backward, as if trying to reverse everything it had already marked. Its faint ticking echoed through the house, unsettling in its persistence. As the days went on, Clara began to notice more strange occurrences tied to the clock. First, it was the sounds. At night, when the world outside was quiet, the clock's ticking became louder, almost deafening, as though it was trying to mark something important. And then there were the things it seemed to affect. The temperature in the room would suddenly drop, an icy chill creeping in as the clock's hands moved backward. The air felt heavy, oppressive. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to drafts or the house settling, but the feeling lingered. It was the way the clock seemed to affect her emotions that unnerved her the most. At first, she would feel a sense of dread when she passed by the clock, a vague unease that she could never quite shake, but it grew stronger over time. On certain nights, Clara felt as though the house was watching her, as though the very walls were alive, breathing with the rhythm of the clock. The ticking seemed to sync with her heartbeat, each beat a reminder that something was wrong, something she couldn't quite understand. The first night Clara truly felt the full weight of the clock's power was a cold, windless evening. She had been reading in the living room, the only light in the room coming from a single lamp beside the clock. As the hands approached midnight, she felt a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched, yet there was no one else in the house. As the clock struck 12, it began its usual backward ticking. But tonight was different. The air thickened, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist. Clara's heart raced. She turned her gaze to the clock, and for the first time she saw it. The hands weren't just moving backward, they were growing. They stretched, extending in unnatural directions, their movements jerky and violent. The ticking grew louder, faster, and then a sudden terrifying silence. The clock stopped, and for a brief moment, Clara could hear something else, something far more disturbing than the ticking. Whispers, low, guttural voices murmuring her name, coming from somewhere deep within the clock. It was as though the clock itself was alive, aware of her presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the clock resumed its backward ticking, as though nothing had happened. Over the next few days, Clara's unease turned into something more. She began to notice other signs of the clock's growing influence. Things in the house started to change when the clock struck midnight. Items would shift positions overnight. A book that had been on the coffee table would be found in the kitchen. The lights would flicker on and off, seemingly controlled by the clock's rhythm. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The house was changing, warping, and she felt herself slipping further and further into its grip. The whispers continued, growing louder at night, always when the clock struck midnight. They were no longer just whispers, they were full sentences, words that made her skin crawl. Clara began hearing the voices more frequently now. They weren't just whispers, they were warnings, desperate cries for help. She could no longer sleep at night. Every time she closed her eyes, the clock's ticking filled her mind, relentless and oppressive. The house seemed to close in on her, the walls stretching and groaning under the weight of the clock's presence. Every night, as the clock struck midnight, she would hear it, the screeching, the desperate sounds of something clawing to get out. And as the nights dragged on, Clara's mind began to crack. She started to see things, visions of her grandmother, of dark, twisted figures moving in the corners of the room. The house was no longer a home, it was a prison, and the clock was the warden. One evening, after weeks of torment, Clara decided she could no longer bear it. She had to destroy the clock, or it would destroy her. With trembling hands, she reached out to grab it, but before she could, the room was flooded with light. The clock's hands stopped moving. The ticking ceased. In the silence, Clara felt a strange calm wash over her. The oppressive feeling, the weight of the clock's power, seemed to vanish. For the first time in weeks, she felt free. But then, she saw it. In the reflection of the clock's glass, Clara saw herself not as she was, but as a hollow shell, her eyes dark and empty. The realization hit her like a cold wave. She wasn't just living in the house, she was becoming part of it. The clock had already claimed her. Its whispers and ticks had already woven themselves into her soul. And as the clock's hands began to move once again, Clara understood. It wasn't just a timepiece, it was a prison. And now she was its newest occupant. The clock's ticking grew louder, faster, until it filled every corner of the room. The hand spun backward relentlessly, and Clara could feel her own time slipping away. As the clock struck midnight once more, she realized the truth. The clock never moved forward. It was always ticking backward, erasing everything, rewinding time itself. And as the final deafening tick echoed through the room, Clara's world disappeared into darkness. The room was quiet, wrapped in the stillness of late-night solitude. Outside, the world slept, but inside the small bedroom, Clara's thoughts raced in the silence. She had always been a night owl, her mind wandering when the world around her was at rest. But tonight felt different, darker, as though the darkness was pressing against her, reaching inside the room and smothering her in its thick, oppressive presence. She sat up in bed, staring at the shadows that clung to the walls. her eyes tracing the shapes in the darkness. It was late, far past midnight, yet she couldn't bring herself to sleep. She had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. A quiet hum of unease settled in her stomach. There was nothing tangible to pin it on, but it lingered, the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the reach of her consciousness. And then she saw it. The first glimpse was fleeting, a shadow flickering at the edge of her vision. It was quick, like a trick of the light, and she almost convinced herself it was nothing. But there it was again, a long, elongated figure that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the corner of the room. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just the darkness, it was something more, something that shouldn't be. For a moment, her mind fought to dismiss the thought, telling herself it was just her eyes playing tricks on her. But as she sat frozen, staring into the dark, the shadow moved again, this time clearly, deliberately. The outline shifted, twisting and undulating as though it were alive, pulling itself into the room. Her heart began to race, the silence now suffocating. She watched as the shadow crept toward the edge of her bed, its shape growing sharper, more defined. It seemed to pause, as if aware of her gaze. Then it moved again. This time it stretched across the floor, inching toward her, its form far too large for the room. There was no sound, no rustle of fabric, no creak of the floor, just the slow, deliberate movement of something unnatural, something that shouldn't be there. The fear in her chest began to build, cold and tight. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, but the feeling of dread gnawed at her. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a presence, one that she could feel in her very bones, pressing down on her. The longer she watched, the more she became certain it was moving with purpose. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in. Clara could feel the weight of the shadow's gaze, even though she couldn't see its eyes. It was like it knew she was watching, like it was drawing closer with every second. She tried to move, to push herself out of bed, but her body felt like it was cemented in place. The paralysis set in. Every muscle in her body screamed for action, but she couldn't respond. The shadow didn't stop. It kept advancing, inching closer to her, as if its only goal was to reach her. The fear intensified. Clara's mind raced with desperate thoughts. What was it? Where did it come from? Why was it here? But there was no answer. There was only the slow, deliberate movement of the shadow as it edged closer to her, its form stretching and warping with every passing moment. The longer it lingered, the more Clara realized that it wasn't a shadow at all. It was something else, something older and far more sinister. It moved with a rhythm, a pattern she couldn't quite place, but she knew it wasn't random. There was intent behind its movements. The shadow crept, paused, then crept again. It circled her bed, tracing invisible lines in the air, its form curling and twisting as if it were preparing to strike. Clara could barely breathe now. The terror inside her was consuming. She couldn't escape it, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but watch as the shadow continued its eerie dance. She was trapped in the paralysis of her own fear. The room now a cage, the air thick with the presence of something unexplainable. As the night wore on, her desperation grew. She tried to scream, to call out, but no sound came. She tried to move, to shift away from the bed, but her body refused to obey. The shadow drew closer, and the sense of impending doom grew sharper. The silence in the room was unbearable, pressing in on her from all sides. And then, in a sudden burst of clarity, Clara realized what she had to do. She had to break free. She couldn't stay here, trapped in this room with that thing. Her hands, trembling and weak, grasped at the bed sheets, pulling herself up, forcing her body to obey. It took all her strength, but slowly she pulled herself to the edge of the bed and stood. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she didn't care. The shadow was almost upon her now, its shape closing in around her, its form so large it filled the room. She turned, desperate to escape, and ran toward the door. But just as she reached the threshold, the shadow enveloped her. It was in her mind, in her thoughts, a suffocating presence that blocked out everything else. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was still again. The shadow was no longer there. Clara stood in the doorway, breathless, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't explain what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure. The shadow was still out there, and it would return. The house was quiet, as it always was late at night. The only sounds were the soft creaks of the floorboards settling and the distant hum of appliances. Emma had just finished her late-night work, her mind exhausted and ready for rest. She sat in the living room, her gaze drifting to the hallway that stretched into the darkness. The hallway light, a dim fixture at the far end, stood as a beacon against the otherwise enveloping blackness. She had always found it comforting, a gentle glow that led to the safety of the bedrooms. Tonight, however, something felt off, though she couldn't place what. For the past few nights, Emma had noticed something strange. The calm that usually came with the stillness of the house had started to feel more unsettling. The hallway light would flicker occasionally, but only when she wasn't looking directly at it. It was subtle at first, just a brief dimming that she could easily attribute to an old bulb. But tonight, the flicker began again, and Emma couldn't shake the odd sensation that something was happening just beyond her comprehension. She glanced at the hallway, the faint light illuminating the shadows that lined the walls. As her eyes moved over it, the light blinked, the briefest flash of darkness overtaking the room. It was more pronounced now, not as fleeting as before. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and stared at the light again. It flickered once more. Emma's breath caught. Why did it only do that when she looked at it? Why didn't it flicker when her gaze was averted? It was a strange, irritating disruption, as though something was deliberately interfering with the quiet of the house. Every time she focused on it, the flicker came, unsettling her nerves. Emma tried to ignore it, but the oddity only grew stronger with each passing minute. The light would flicker the instant her eyes met it, but as soon as she turned her head away, it remained still, unchanged. It was as though something was toying with her, challenging her to understand what was happening. As the days went on, Emma couldn't dismiss the feeling that the flicker was somehow connected to her presence. There was a strange, almost sinister pattern to it. Every time she looked at the light, it flickered. But the moment she stopped focusing on it, the light held steady. She could no longer ignore the sensation that the light was trying to communicate with her. But how? And why? Was it just a malfunctioning bulb, or was something deeper at play? It felt as though the light itself was aware of her gaze, responding to it as if in anticipation. Curiosity pushed Emma to investigate. She spent several days watching the light, waiting for it to flicker when she looked. But even after hours of staring at it, the light remained unchanged. It was only when she allowed her mind to wander, when her focus drifted, that it began its subtle dance. It flickered, as if waiting for her attention. Every time she tried to make sense of it, she felt the weight of some unseen force pulling her focus back to the hallway. Something about the light seemed different now. Emma felt as though it was no longer just a malfunction, but there was more to this flickering than she had first realized. It was as though there was something hidden behind it, a secret she couldn't see but could only feel in the tension that grew every time it flickered. The idea that the light was connected to forces she couldn't explain grew stronger. Perhaps it was a signal, or perhaps it was a warning. She couldn't decide, but she could sense that it had a purpose. The light wasn't just malfunctioning, it was reacting to her presence in ways that made her question her own perception. The deeper Emma looked into the hallway, the more she began to feel as if she wasn't alone. There was something lurking just out of her reach, something that existed in the same space, but outside of her immediate awareness. The flicker of the light was more than just an annoying malfunction. It was a constant reminder that something was watching, something waiting. It was as if she had crossed a threshold, and now the flicker was the only sign of something far darker lingering just beyond her vision. Determined to break the cycle, Emma decided to stop the flicker once and for all. She tried everything she could think of. She replaced the bulb, checked the wiring, and even turned off the light for hours to see if that would reset it. But when she switched it back on, the same flicker began again, only this time more intense, more persistent. It was as though the light itself was resisting her attempts to stop it. The more she tried to exert control, the stronger the disruption became, until she could no longer focus on anything else. It was clear now that the light wasn't just a light, it was a key. And every time Emma tried to force its behavior to conform to her will, the connection between her and the light grew stronger, and she began to understand its secret. The flickering was a link between the visible and the invisible. Every time she looked at it, she was peering into another space, another realm that only revealed itself when she focused her attention on it. The light was not just malfunctioning, it was a portal, and when she tried to break the cycle, she only deepened her connection to it. And then, one final time, the light flickered and stopped. Emma stared at it, waiting for the next interruption, the next shift in reality. But it never came. The flicker had become part of her, just as the space behind the light had become part of her perception. And though the light no longer flickered in the way it had, she knew it wasn't gone. The unresolved flicker would always be there, just beyond the edge of her vision, waiting for the next time she looked at it.
The day had been full of noise, traffic, voices, the hum of the city, until the moment it all came to a stop. The world seemed to hold its breath as Emma stood in the garden, the breeze gently brushing through the trees, the sound of the wind a constant companion in the background. It was a peaceful afternoon, one she had longed for in the chaos of her daily life. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the soft rustle of leaves, the way the wind seemed to carry away the weight of the day's thoughts. But then everything changed. The wind, once steady and constant, ceased abruptly. In an instant, there was no breeze, no rustling of the trees, just an unnatural, oppressive stillness that hung in the air. The air felt heavier now, thick with a sense of quiet that made Emma's skin prickle. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined it, but the absence of the wind felt too stark, too abrupt. The world around her had come to a complete halt, and she felt as though time itself had paused. And then, as though from the depths of the silence, she heard it. The first whisper was so faint, she wasn't sure if it was real. She strained her ears, searching for the source. It wasn't a voice she recognized, but it was unmistakably a voice. Soft, like a breath against her ear, yet distant, as if coming from somewhere far away. Her heart quickened as she listened. The whisper came again, a little clearer this time, as though the speaker was trying to be heard. "Come closer," it seemed to say, the words almost lost in the sudden stillness of the air. Emma froze. There was no one around. The garden was empty. Yet the whisper lingered, curling around her like a cold draft, beckoning her. She turned her head, hoping to spot someone hiding in the bushes, playing some cruel trick. But there was nothing, just the empty stretch of garden, the barren trees, and the thick, palpable silence. Emma stepped back, her breath shallow as she strained to hear again. The whisper faded, but the lingering unease did not. It was as though the sound had come from within her own mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was not a thought. It was something external, something real. The silence stretched on, heavier now, more oppressive. Emma stood still, listening intently. There it was again, a whisper, barely perceptible. "Why don't you look?" The voice sounded so close, yet when she spun around to search for its source, there was nothing, no one. The garden remained still, untouched. Her pulse raced, the quiet of the world pressing in on her, heightening the tension. She was no longer sure if the whispers were real or if the stillness of the wind had begun to play tricks on her. But the whispers continued. They were soft at first, just a faint brushing of sound, but with every passing moment they grew clearer, more insistent. "You can't escape," one whispered said. "It's coming for you," another hissed. The words were unmistakable now, each one chilling her to the bone. Emma felt the coldness creeping into her veins, and yet she couldn't pull herself away from the source of the sound, unable to stop herself from listening. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, as though they were closing in on her from every direction. Frantic now, Emma began searching for the source. Her eyes darted from the trees to the bushes, from the empty corners of the garden to the distant edges of the house, but there was nothing. The garden, still bathed in the pale light of the afternoon, was empty. No wind, no movement, just the relentless whispers, growing more numerous, more piercing with every passing second. She backed away, panic starting to set in. Her hands trembled and her throat constricted as the voices seemed to press in on her. "Look," one whispered urgently, "look behind you." Emma spun around, her heart thudding in her chest, only to find nothing but the same empty air. And then it struck her. The realization hit like a wave, overwhelming her in its simplicity. The whispers were not coming from anywhere in the garden. They were coming from the very air itself, from the emptiness left behind by the wind. The wind had stopped, and in that silence, the whispers had found their voice. It wasn't a trick, and it wasn't her imagination. The wind had ceased, and now something else, something far darker, had taken its place. She stumbled back, dread pooling in her stomach as the whispers swirled around her, relentless in their demands. "Don't ignore us," they hissed. "We've been waiting." She covered her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they were inside her mind now, too close, too real to escape. Every whisper was a weight she couldn't shake, a presence that seemed to crawl into her very thoughts. The whispers never stopped. They continued to echo in the stillness, drawing closer, surrounding her with their incessant murmurs. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The air felt thick and suffocating, the voices louder than ever, each one melding together into a cacophony of terror. And then, just as she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, the wind returned. It was sudden, almost violent, rushing back with a gust that swept through the trees, sending the branches swaying and the leaves rustling again. The world seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight of the silence lifting. The whispers died, snuffed out by the returning breeze, as though the wind had blown them away. But Emma knew something had changed. The wind had returned, yes, but the whispering still lingered in her mind. It hadn't stopped. It would never stop. The wind had merely pushed it back, but the voices, the whispers, were still there, waiting for the next moment of stillness. And next time, they would be louder, more insistent.
It was well past midnight when you first heard it. A knock on the door. It was faint, but it cut through the stillness of the night like a jagged edge. You hadn't been expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. You hesitated for a moment, unsure whether you had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. The kind of knock that felt too urgent to be ignored. Your heart skipped a beat. Who could be knocking at this hour? The neighborhood was quiet. Everyone else tucked away in their homes, and there was nothing that seemed out of place. Still, you felt a creeping unease crawl up your spine as you slowly got up from the couch. You made your way toward the door, every step heavier than the last. The air felt thick, as if something unseen was pressing against you, but you couldn't quite explain why. The knocks had been so sudden, so out of place, and the silence afterward felt even more ominous. You approached the door cautiously, your mind racing through possible explanations. Was it a prank? Or maybe a neighbor who had lost track of time? The night was too quiet for any of it to feel normal. With your heart pounding in your chest, you peered through the peephole. The faint light from the hallway illuminated the outside, casting long shadows that stretched along the ground. But there was no one there. The doorway was empty. A wave of confusion and relief washed over you. You blinked, certain that you hadn't imagined the knock. It had been so real, so sharp. You checked again, scanning the empty space outside, but nothing. Just the stillness of the night and the faint glow from the streetlights. You pulled away from the door, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling, but you couldn't. You tried to convince yourself it was nothing, some random noise from the night, but that did little to calm the tightness in your chest. You locked the door, checked the locks again, and then returned to your couch. The knock, however, echoed in your mind, lingering long after you had tried to put it out of your thoughts. The next night, it happened again. At precisely 3 a.m., the knock came. 3 sharp raps against the door, precise and deliberate, echoing in the silence. This time, there was no hesitation. You were already out of bed, moving toward the door before your mind could even process what was happening. You couldn't understand it. Why? Who? Why the same time? You approached the peephole again, but this time you didn't blink. There was nothing outside, just the empty, still air of the night. No one. A chill ran down your spine as you stepped back, heart racing once more. The knock had come again, unmistakable and real, but there was still no one there. You checked the locks, the windows, the surrounding area, but everything was as it should be. It was all too bizarre, too unnerving. No matter how many times you checked, the same thing kept happening. The knocks at 3 a.m. and no one outside when you looked. The pattern became undeniable. Every night at the same time, the knocks came. It was as though they were waiting for you, waiting for the precise moment when the house would be still, when the world outside would be silent, when you would be alone with the noise. Each night, the fear built inside you. You couldn't make sense of it. Was someone playing a twisted game? Or was something else at play? Something that defied logic, something that didn't belong. You started to investigate, searching through everything you could find. You scoured the neighborhood for any sign of who might be knocking on your door at that hour. But no one had seen anything unusual. No one heard the knocks, not like you did. The neighbors were oblivious, their homes as quiet as ever. But you knew what you had heard, and you knew that whatever was happening was not normal. You even went so far as to install a camera outside, hoping to catch whoever or whatever was coming to your door at that hour. But the footage only deepened the mystery. Every night, the knock came, but the camera showed nothing. No one was visible, just the empty space outside your door, the faint light illuminating the pavement. The camera had captured nothing but the sound of the knocks, sharp, loud, and inescapable. The whispers of doubt began to creep in. Was it possible you had imagined it? That the stress of the past few days had made you hear things? But deep down, you knew it was real. You couldn't explain it, but you couldn't deny it either. And then, one night, the knock came again. But this time, when you looked through the peephole, you saw something different. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing at the door. It was only for a brief moment, but it was enough. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring back at you. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. A wave of panic washed over you. What had you just seen? Was it real? The fear that had been building finally surged to the surface, choking you as you scrambled to lock the door, to secure yourself from whatever was out there. But you knew deep down that no lock, no barrier could keep you safe from whatever had been knocking at your door. The last knock came the following night, the final one. The moment the sound echoed through the still air, you rushed to the door, but you didn't need to look through the peephole. The silence told you everything. No one was there, no figure, no one waiting in the dark, only the cold, empty space outside. But you knew The knock had been a warning, a reminder that whatever had been waiting for you had never left. It would return. It always would. The last knock wasn't an end. It was a beginning.